You know, in my 3 decades of service at the Galactic Military Academy, I thought I had seen everything. Commander Thexnell here, and let me tell you, running combat training for the galaxy's most prestigious war college tends to give you a certain perspective on things. My scales have weathered more battles than most species have recorded in their entire histories, and my reptilian heritage means I do not exaggerate for dramatic effect. Unlike some species I could mention, our floating fortress, Nexus Prime, sits in the neutral zone between 12 major star systems, accepting only the finest warrior candidates from 47 different civilizations. We have trained Korathi berserkers who can tear through titanium plating with their bare claws. We have graduated Zephyrian mind warriors who can kill with a thought. Hell, we even managed to civilize a few Vorthak death cultists, though that took some doing and several replacement training dummies. But then the humans showed up. Oh yes, the famous Deathworlders from that little blue marble they call Earth. When the Galactic Council first made contact with them, the xenobiologists nearly had collective heart attacks, or whatever passes for cardiac events in their respective species. Apparently, these creatures evolved on a planet so hostile that it regularly tries to kill everything living on it. Storms that could level cities, predators that hunt in coordinated packs, and do not even get me started on their weather patterns. The Council, in their infinite wisdom, decided these humans might make decent soldiers. Probationary membership, they called it. A trial run to see if these pink, squishy bipeds could handle real military training alongside proper warriors. Most of us instructors were skeptical. Have you seen a human? They look like someone took a Zephyrian, removed all the useful bits like natural armor and claws, then painted them various shades of beige and brown. They cannot even regulate their own body temperature properly. They leak salt water when stressed, which seems like a terrible design flaw for a species that claims to be apex predators. But the brass insisted, so here we are, babysitting a handful of these Deathworlders while they stumble through basic combat protocols. Most of them seem nice enough, I suppose. Polite, eager to learn, completely outmatched by literally every other species in the Academy, but enthusiastic about it. Little did I know that one particular human was about to give me the most educational experience of my very long career. Now, let me paint you a picture of the main players in this delightful disaster. First, we have Corporal Maya Blackwood, all 5 feet and 4 inches of unremarkable human female, 22 years old according to her file, though human aging makes about as much sense as quantum economics. Brown hair pulled back in what they call a ponytail, which honestly looks more like a small mammal dyed on her head, pale skin that looks like it has never seen proper sunlight, and these peculiar blue eyes that seem to take in everything while giving away absolutely nothing. Maya had this habit of sitting in the back corner of every briefing, never speaking unless directly addressed, never volunteering for demonstrations. The kind of student who blends into the furniture so well you forget they are there. Most instructors assumed she was struggling to keep up with the advanced curriculum. I mean, look at her. She appeared about as threatening as a Florian peace lily, and those things literally cannot survive without constant hugs. Then we have Lieutenant Corvin Steelclaw of the Draknari Empire, and oh, what a specimen he was. 8 feet of pure predatory muscle wrapped in natural-scale armor that could deflect plasma rounds. Arms thick as my torso, ending in claws that could punch through starship hulls. His species evolved from apex hunters on a world where everything tried to eat everything else, and they won that evolutionary arms race by being bigger, faster, and more vicious than anything else on their planet. Corvin strutted around the academy like he owned the place, which, given his family's political connections and his own impressive combat record, he practically did. Graduated top of his class from the Draknari War College, heir to a military dynasty stretching back 12 generations, and absolutely convinced that anything not born with fangs and claws was evolutionary refuse. He took particular pleasure in making snide comments about the human experiments, as he called them. Loud enough for everyone to hear, just quiet enough to avoid official reprimands. Things like wondering if the Academy had lowered its standards to accommodate pets, or suggesting that humans might be better suited for clerical work than combat training. The other cadets fell somewhere between these extremes. We had Sergeant Volus, a crystalline-based silicoid whose idea of humor involved making jokes about carbon-based life forms. Ensign Brex Tar from the Hive Collective, who communicated primarily through pheromone releases that smelled like rotting vegetation. Captain Nissus, a void walker whose species naturally phased between dimensions, making her nearly impossible to hit in combat. All of them professional warriors from proud military traditions. All of them absolutely certain that humans were the weakest link in their class. The Academy operates on a strict hierarchy based on combat performance, and let me tell you, our sparring protocols are taken very seriously indeed. We use Class 7 energy dampening fields that reduce all kinetic impacts by 90%, biomonitors that immediately halt matches if vital signs spike dangerously, even medical teams standing by with regeneration pods. Safety first, as they say, because replacing cadets is expensive and the paperwork is a nightmare. Each species gets evaluated on their natural combat abilities, adjusted for physiological differences. A Draknari fighting a Florian is hardly fair, so we use weight classes, reach advantages, and natural armor ratings to balance things out. The humans, bless their squishy hearts, got placed in the fragile beings category, along with the telepathic moth people and those sentient gas clouds from the nebula sector. Now, about Draknari culture. These creatures worship strength like it is a religion. Their entire social structure revolves around combat prowess, from childhood dueling ceremonies to their death matches for political leadership. They have phrases in their language that translate roughly to weakness is sin and victory cleanses the soul. Lovely people at parties, I am sure. The military academies make our training look like a recreational spa retreat. Corvin embodied every stereotype about his species, amplified by generational wealth and political privilege. His combat record read like a greatest hits album of institutional brutality. It defeated a Korathi berserker in under 30 seconds, outmaneuvered a void walker in dimensional combat, even managed to subdue one of those Hive collective drones, which is like fighting a living computer with anger management issues. The human failures had become something of a running joke among the upper-class cadets. Poor Corporal Jenkins got his arm broken in 3 places during his first week, though to be fair, he did volunteer to spar with a tungsten-class mechanoid. Cadet Morrison lasted exactly 4 minutes against a Zephyrian mind warrior before suffering what their medical files diplomatically called severe psychological trauma. And do not get me started on the incident with Petty Officer Williams and the Plasma Bear. That required extensive therapy for both participants. The instructors started implementing what we unofficially called the human protocols. Mandatory protective gear, limited sparring partners, and absolutely no contact with anything that could accidentally vaporize them. We treated them like explosive ordnance, extremely dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. Corvin found this absolutely hilarious. He would make theatrical gestures of concern whenever a human entered the training bay, asking loudly if anyone had brought the breakage insurance or wondering if we should wrap them in protective foam. His cronies ate it up, naturally. Nothing builds camaraderie quite like collectively mocking the weakest members of your group. Maya took all of this with that peculiar human expression they call stoic acceptance. Never complained, never argued, never showed any emotion beyond mild interest in the proceedings. Some of the instructors thought she was mentally deficient. Others assumed she was simply overwhelmed by the advanced training and trying not to wash out of the program. Looking back now, I realize we were all missing something rather important about human psychology. But hindsight, as they say, is always perfect vision, and at the time we were all too busy being impressed with our own superiority to notice the signs. That particular morning started like any other disaster, with what seemed like a perfectly reasonable announcement. Professor Krell Thax, our senior combat instructor and a veteran of 17 different wars, stood before the assembled class with his usual expression of barely contained irritation. Today we will be conducting cross-species sparring exercises, he announced in that gravelly voice that could cut through titanium plating. Random partner assignments to test adaptability against unfamiliar fighting styles. Standard safety protocols apply, energy dampeners at maximum, medical teams on standby. I watched from my observation post as the cadets began their usual pre-match rituals. The Hive collective representatives started synchronizing their pheromone levels. The Void Walkers began phase shifting between dimensions to warm up their spatial awareness. And the Draknari, naturally, started flexing their muscles and making intimidating growling sounds. That is when Corvin raised one massive clawed hand, a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and arrogant at the same time. Professor, if I may volunteer for a specific pairing. I believe it would be educational for everyone if I were to demonstrate proper combat technique against one of our newer students. His yellow eyes locked directly onto Maya, who was quietly checking her equipment harness in the corner. The implication was crystal clear to every being in that training bay, and the reaction was immediate. Whispered conversations broke out among the cadets, and I could practically hear the mental calculation of betting odds. Lieutenant Steelclaw, Professor Krellthax said with the tone of someone who has dealt with too many overconfident young warriors, "This is a controlled training exercise, not a gladiatorial exhibition. You will engage with appropriate restraint and follow all safety protocols to the letter." Of course, Professor Corvin replied with a grin that showed entirely too many razor-sharp teeth. I would never want to accidentally harm our fragile classmate. I simply thought she might benefit from experiencing proper Draknari combat techniques in a safe, controlled environment. The betting pools started immediately. Sergeant Volus was quietly taking wagers through crystalline resonance frequencies. The odds heavily favored Corvin lasting longer than Maya's previous opponents, with most bets focusing on whether she would last 30 seconds or a full minute before yielding. Maya, for her part, continued her equipment check with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else, adjusted her protective padding, tested her joint mobility, performed a few basic stretching exercises. No theatrics, no intimidation displays, no apparent concern about facing a warrior twice her size with natural weapons that could slice through combat armor. Corvin, meanwhile, was putting on quite the show, demonstrating his reach advantage by shadowboxing with invisible opponents, making sure everyone could see the impressive muscle definition beneath his scales, and generally playing to his audience like a seasoned performer. The contrast could not have been more striking, and it reinforced every preconception we had about the respective capabilities of our two combatants. When the energy-dampening field activated with its characteristic blue shimmer, I settled back to watch what I assumed would be a very brief and educational demonstration. The combat zone measured 30 meters square, plenty of room for maneuvering, with sensor arrays tracking every movement for post-match analysis. "Combatants ready?" Professor Krellthax called out, his hand hovering over the match timer. "Remember, this is a learning exercise. Control your strikes, respect the safety protocols, and stop immediately when I call halt." Maya nodded once, settling into what looked like a defensive stance. Corvin cracked his knuckles with sounds like breaking timber and assumed the traditional Draknari combat position, all coiled muscle and barely contained aggression. Let's begin. The first exchange went exactly as everyone expected. Corvin lunged forward with a textbook Draknari power strike, his massive fist moving fast enough to create small sonic booms despite the energy dampeners. Maya dodged. Barely, the displaced air ruffling her hair as 8 inches of scaled death passed through the space her head had occupied moments before. The size difference was immediately apparent. Corvin's reach advantage meant he could strike from distances where Maya could not even touch him. His natural armor meant that even if she landed a hit, it would likely bounce off harmlessly. And his strength advantage was so overwhelming that a single solid blow would end the match instantly. Maya seemed to realize this too, because she immediately adopted what looked like a purely defensive strategy. Duck, weave, sidestep, retreat. She moved constantly, never staying in one position long enough for Corvin to line up a proper strike. The other cadets began murmuring among themselves, clearly interpreting her tactics as desperate survival instincts rather than any coherent fighting strategy. "Running away already?" Corvin taunted, his voice carrying easily across the training bay. "I thought Deathworlders were supposed to be dangerous." Maya did not respond, just kept moving in those fluid, economical motions that looked almost like dancing. Every time Corvin committed to an attack, she was already somewhere else, always staying just outside his considerable reach. It was actually quite impressive from a technical standpoint, though I could see why the other cadets were interpreting it as cowardice. Corvin's frustration became increasingly obvious as the match progressed. His strikes became more aggressive, less controlled, and definitely more frequent. The energy dampeners were working overtime, dissipating the kinetic force of his increasingly wild swings. What had started as a demonstration of superior technique was devolving into an undisciplined brawling match. Stand still and fight, he snarled, launching himself forward in a move that was more tackle than combat technique. Maya slipped aside again, and I could see the embarrassment beginning to color Corvin's tactical decisions. Being made to look foolish by a human in front of his peers was apparently not sitting well with his Draknari pride. That is when he made his critical error in judgment. Instead of continuing with proper striking techniques, Corvin decided to use his size advantage to simply overpower his opponent. He feinted left, then lunged right, managing to corner Maya against the energy barrier that marked the combat zone's boundary. Before she could dodge again, his massive hand shot out and closed around her throat in what was clearly an illegal chokehold, lifting her feet completely off the ground. What happened next will be burned into my memory for the rest of my very long life. Maya's response was not panic, not struggling, not the desperate flailing I expected from someone being strangled by a creature 3 times their size. Instead, she went perfectly still for exactly 1 heartbeat, and I swear I saw something change in those blue eyes. Something cold and calculating and absolutely terrifying. Then she moved. I have watched combat footage from 17 different wars. I have seen Korathi berserkers in full battle fury, Zephyrian assassins phasing through solid matter, and Vorthak death cultists performing their legendary blood rituals. But I have never seen anything move with the precise, economical violence that Maya Blackwood displayed in the next 3 seconds. Her right hand came up in a sharp, upward strike that caught Corvin directly under his extended arm, hitting a nerve cluster that temporarily paralyzed his grip. Her left hand simultaneously grabbed his wrist, not to pull away, but to anchor herself for what came next. As his fingers loosened, she dropped her full body weight while twisting, using his own grip as a pivot point to swing her legs up and around his arm. The biomechanical leverage was perfect. Corvin's arm was now hyperextended at an impossible angle, with Maya's entire body weight creating torque against his elbow joint. But that was just the setup. As she completed the rotation, her knee came up and drove into his shoulder with a sickening crunch that the energy dampeners could not completely absorb. I heard something snap, a sound like breaking crystal that made every being in the training bay wince in sympathetic pain. Corvin released her immediately, roaring in shock and agony as he stumbled backward, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Maya landed in a perfect crouch, rolled once to dissipate the impact, and came up in a fighting stance that looked nothing like the defensive posture she had been using before. Medical emergency. Professor Krelthax bellowed, his hand already activating the emergency beacon. Shut down the dampening field. Medical team to Combat Zone 7 immediately. The change in Maya was striking. Gone was the quiet, unassuming human who blended into the background. This was a predator, pure and simple, with every muscle coiled for violence and those blue eyes tracking Corvin's movements like a targeting computer. She looked like she was considering whether to press her attack, despite the obvious fact that the match was over. Corvin was in shock, staring at his ruined shoulder with the expression of someone who could not quite process what had just happened. His collarbone was clearly broken, probably in multiple places, and his arm was completely useless. But more than the physical damage, his pride had taken a devastating hit. Impossible, he whispered, and then louder, impossible. The dampening field, the safety protocols, how did she? The energy dampeners reduce kinetic impact, Maya said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the training bay. They do not eliminate leverage, joint manipulation, or pressure point strikes. Your species relies too heavily on brute force and not enough on technique. The medical team arrived and immediately began working on Corvin, injecting him with pain suppressors and stabilizing his shoulder for transport to the regeneration bay. But every other being in that room was staring at Maya with expressions ranging from shock to horror to what I can only describe as existential dread. Sergeant Volus was the first to speak, his crystalline voice resonating with frequencies that indicated extreme distress. She crippled him. In 3 seconds. Through military-grade safety equipment. How is that possible? Ensign Brextar released a pheromone cloud that smelled like fear and confusion, which pretty much summed up everyone's emotional state. Captain Neesis had actually phase-shifted partially out of our dimension, which was her species' equivalent of hiding under a blanket. "Professor," one of the Korathi cadets called out, his voice carefully controlled, "what exactly are we dealing with here?" Maya had returned to her original quiet demeanor, checking her equipment and acting like she had not just dismantled one of the Academy's most dangerous warriors with casual efficiency. But now we were all seeing her differently. Now we understood that her previous defensive strategy had not been fear or incompetence. It had been restraint. The medical bay was buzzing with activity when I arrived to check on Corvin's condition. 3 different species of medical technicians were working on him, their equipment humming with the familiar sounds of bone regeneration and tissue repair. The damage was extensive but not permanent, thank the void. His collarbone would heal completely within 48 hours, though the psychological wounds might take considerably longer. "Commander Thexnell," Corvin said when he saw me approaching his medical pod. His voice was subdued, lacking the usual arrogant confidence that had defined his personality. "I need to understand what happened. That was not normal combat technique. That was something else entirely." I settled into the visitor's chair, my scales clicking against the metal frame. "What do you remember about the engagement?" "Everything," he replied, staring at the ceiling with unfocused eyes. "Every detail. The way she moved, the precision of her strikes, the complete lack of hesitation. She knew exactly what she was doing from the moment I grabbed her throat. This was not a panicked response or lucky accident. She had planned that entire sequence." Meanwhile, Maya was in the Academy's main briefing room, calmly filling out incident reports as if she had just completed a routine training exercise. Professor Krell Thax was interviewing her, trying to understand the technical aspects of what we had witnessed. "The Corporal Blackwood," he was saying when I entered the room, "your combat performance today was unexpected. Can you explain your tactical approach?" Maya looked up from her paperwork with that same mild expression she always wore. Lieutenant Steelclaw made several strategic errors. He allowed frustration to compromise his technique, abandoned proper defensive positioning, and violated safety protocols by attempting an illegal chokehold. I responded with appropriate force to neutralize the threat. "Appropriate force?" Professor Krell Thax's voice carried more than a hint of incredulity. "You broke his collarbone." "I could have broken his neck," Maya replied matter-of-factly, "or dislocated his shoulder permanently, or crushed his larynx. The collarbone break was the least damaging option that would effectively end his attack." The casual way she listed these alternatives sent a chill through every instructor in the room. This was not boasting or intimidation. This was simply a technical assessment of available options, delivered with the same tone she might use to discuss equipment maintenance procedures. Dr. Velthar, our xenopsychology specialist, leaned forward with obvious fascination. "Corporal, during your previous sparring matches, you appeared to be struggling with the physical demands of combat training. Was this an act?" "Not an act," Maya corrected. "Adaptation. Your training protocols are designed around species that rely primarily on natural weapons and superior physical attributes. Humans evolved differently. We use tools, tactics, and techniques to overcome larger, stronger opponents. What you interpreted as weakness was actually assessment and preparation." The implications of this statement rippled through the room like a shockwave. Every failure we had witnessed, every instance of apparent human inadequacy, suddenly took on a completely different meaning. They had not been failing to adapt to our methods. They had been learning our methods while maintaining their own. Word of the incident spread through the Academy faster than a plasma fire in an oxygen-rich environment. Within hours, every cadet, instructor, and administrative official knew that the quiet human girl had put one of our most accomplished warriors in the medical bay, using nothing but technique and leverage. The betting pools that had been so confident in Corvin's victory were now frantically trying to calculate odds for future human matches. The Draknari delegation was in emergency session, apparently debating whether their traditional combat doctrines needed revision. Even the Hive Collective had begun analyzing human combat footage with what their spokesperson described as intense professional interest. When Corvin was finally released from medical care, he sought out Maya in the Academy's common area. I happened to be nearby reviewing training schedules when their conversation took place. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carefully formal. And my respect. I underestimated you, and I allowed my prejudices to cloud my judgment. Maya looked up from her meal, considered his words for a moment, then nodded. Apology accepted. But understand this, Lieutenant. Every human in this academy could have done what I did. We are not here because we are weak. We are here because we are dangerous, and your people want to make sure we are dangerous in the right direction. The pride that had once defined Corvin's personality was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. That was 6 months ago, and I can honestly say that the Galactic Military Academy has never been the same since. We have completely overhauled our training protocols, not to accommodate human weaknesses, but to account for human capabilities. The fragile beings classification has been quietly retired, and humans now train alongside our most advanced combat specialists. The betting pools have become considerably more interesting. Last week, Cadet Thompson put a Vorthak death cultist in the regeneration bay using something she called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which apparently translates to ground fighting that makes grown warriors cry for their mothers. 2 days later, Corporal Martinez demonstrated why humans excel at something called psychological warfare by convincing a telepathic moth person to surrender without throwing a single punch. Our medical staff has requisitioned additional regeneration equipment specifically for non-human cadets injured during sparring with human partners. The requisition forms list the reason as educational experiences with Deathworlder combat methodology, which is administratively correct but fails to capture the existential terror involved. Professor Krelthax has begun incorporating human tactics into the standard curriculum, much to the dismay of species that prefer straightforward applications of superior firepower. Apparently, concepts like misdirection, psychological manipulation, and exploiting opponent weaknesses are revolutionary ideas to beings who evolved with natural weapons and armor. As for Corvin, he has become something of a human specialist, in studying their combat techniques with the dedication of a scholar and the respect of someone who has learned not to underestimate apparently inferior opponents. He recently requested transfer to Earth for advanced training in what humans call mixed martial arts. His family is reportedly horrified. Maya Blackwood graduated at the top of her class and accepted a position as a combat instructor specializing in asymmetric warfare tactics. Her first lecture, titled How to Fight Bigger, Stronger, Better Armed Opponents and Win, had a waiting list that stretched across 3 star systems. The Galactic Council has quietly begun revising their assessment of human military potential. The term Deathworlder has taken on new meaning in diplomatic circles, shifting from primitive savage to extremely dangerous and unpredictable ally. Trade negotiations with Earth now include clauses specifically addressing human military advisors and training exchanges. Looking back on that day, I realize we all learned something important about the nature of strength and the danger of assumptions. We assumed that bigger meant better, that natural weapons trumped technique, and that a species without claws or fangs could not possibly threaten apex predators. We were wrong about humans, and I suspect we have been wrong about quite a few other things as well. Evolution, it turns out, has more than one path to creating perfect killers. Some species develop claws and fangs and natural armor, others develop brains and creativity and the terrifying ability to turn any situation into a weapon. Humans, as it happens, chose the second option. And frankly, that makes them the most dangerous species I have ever encountered. The Academy's new motto, suggested by Maya herself, now hangs above the entrance to every training bay. It is not the size of the warrior in the fight, but the size of the fight in the warrior. Somehow I do not think we will be underestimating humans again anytime soon.